Okay, hey guys. For those of you who haven't sat with me in the classroom, you won't have heard this little bit for the when I do the pediatric stuff. I often teach this, but it's something that you sort of touch on in school all the time, but that no one ever explains. My guess is that they don't actually know how it works, but this is sort of the thing. Okay, when you are born, you enter a cycle, right? So from birth to death is a cycle, right? So the if you live to an old age, let's say, there's two other cycles. There's the pregnancy. The entire pregnancy is a cycle, and it proceeds according to the five elements. And then there's like a little mini mental cycle that we can talk about at another time. But here, what we're talking about is your entire life from birth to death and how it proceeds along the course of the five elements, so that different parts of your life are governed by a particular sort of element. So in this case, your life cycle, your whole life, it starts with wood. It's considered a yin cycle because it's sort of the birth and death. It's in the physical plane. One of them is the yang cycle because it just speaks to psychological development in children. But this one is a yin cycle, and so therefore yin cycles start with wood, right? So you think about like yin channels in the body, the yin meridians, they start with wood. So here we start with wood. And remember in school, when you were in school, they said something to the effect that humans develop along the lines of 7 and 8. Right, so girls develop in cycles of 7, and boys develop in cycles of 8, and so that's why girls mature faster, right? This is very poignant in children, right? And maybe in adults too. But that 7 and 8, right? So this is what they're referring to. So let me lay this out for you. Okay, so when you're born, you enter the wood phase, and the wood phase refers to childhood. Okay. And this makes sense, right? This is wood, it's spring, vigorous growth, new life, sort of new life emerging from the womb of the dark womb, where there's not so much light, sort of like the winter time or something like that. Then you emerge out of the womb and it's very bright and all this, the blooming, buzzing confusion of life, as they say. This is the wood phase. Children grow very rapidly. Things are changing so fast for them. And this is something that we see in the springtime, right? Very vigorous growth, lots of new plants, new animals, babies being born in the animal world. So this is, it's an obvious association here. Wood being associated with childhood. Okay, so this proceeds then for two cycles of 7 and 8. So for girls, this proceeds for two cycles. So from 0 to 14 years old, you are said to be in the wood phase. And for boys, from 0 to 16. Okay? And wood, we've talked about this, right, in past episodes, that what wood is it's a relational thing. It refers to nature, and nature does not exist in a vacuum. It's nature only exists because of its relationships, right? And wood people are like this as well. They don't tend to contract unless they're quite unhealthy. They tend to make a lot of relationships and be in relationships, and they kind of thrive on relationships. In a way, they sort of require relationships in order to self-define. You see this a lot in woody kids. They sort of self-define. They sort of define the world around them by the relationships that they have. And this is certainly true for adults, of course, right? So woody people are much more prone to define themselves in terms of their relationships. And this also means that, that their relationships throw them off a lot, either give them great joy or not, or the opposite. And they're less stable in that sense. There's not that stability of emotions, and it's relationships that really change that up and down. And so this in childhood, that's in a sense, if you look at it from that perspective, that is in a sense what childhood is about. It's socialization. Children learning to be socialized, learning how to navigate the world, right? So there's all this physical side of things where children are growing and rapidly evolving and that, but then there's also this mental side of things, which is, the main thing that they're learning is how to navigate our social world, sort of the human milieu, so to speak. And so this goes for 2 cycles of 7 and 8. Okay. So girls when they're 14, boys when they're 16. So at some point in the latter part of the wood phase, some kind of transition begins to occur, right? Where they, as these kids get older, maybe, in early tween age, early teen age, they start to kind of fight for more independence. They want to be out of the house more. They start to notice, they start to have attractions, right? So maybe they have, more out and out crushes, even like, little boyfriend girlfriend situations and that kind of thing. And maybe even, those kids that were in middle school that had seemed to be in long-term relationships already, this kind of thing, right? So they're making some kind of transition. They start to be more independent, have independent ideas that are independent of their parents, in a sense. They want to do their own thing. And even things like starting to like smell bad, like under armpit smell and messy rooms. And this is where any of you who have kids, this is right around the age where things kind of go off the rails sometimes with certain kids. And, because they really, they kind of funny, they get kind of irrational in a way. And all of this stuff points to them making this transition to fire. And call it what you want, adolescence, early adulthood, this transition. It's this transition period between childhood to adulthood in some sense, right? And what do we call this? We call it puberty, right? So in Chinese medicine, we're fond of saying, at 14 for girls and at 16 for boys, this heavenly essence, this tian gui, sort of they sort of receive, or it is produced in the body, and this is puberty. This is around the age when girls will have menarche, their first period, right? So the beginnings of puberty, the actualizing of puberty, this sort of process really is this transition from wood to fire, okay? And then fire really is this time at, fire is a sort of short-lived element, so to speak. It sort of explodes out of nowhere, and then it burns itself out quite quickly. Once the fuel is gone, it goes, right? So in this case, because of the nature of fire to be sort of an ephemeral kind of element, it gets 1 cycle. Okay, so 14 to 21 for girls, 16 to 24 for boys. And this is the time when these kids often leave the house, right? This 14 to 21, it's in the United States, emancipation at 18, so you're sort of free to move about, the cabin. And this is the time when kids will often move out of the house, get jobs and live on their own and sort of play adult to some degree, right? So this is sort of this fire time. Fire time is often, where within that time frame of 14 to 21, you probably fell in love for the first time. A very fiery kind of thing to do. You really move out into your space. This might be where a lot of people sort of enter a party phase, so to speak. They're young and emancipated and kind of free in that sense. So they, or whatever it is. Right. So this is, and it's fire. So fire is interested in novelty. Fire is interested in what's new and exciting and fun. Right. So this is a time when you really sort of try to, in some sense, without thinking about it, you're finding out what you like, what you enjoy, how you like to live your life. Sort of setting the stage for the rest of your life. You date and this and that, and but for a lot of people, it's not a time where they're buckled down in a long-term relationship. You date here, you date there, and these things come and go. You don't even know what you like yet, so what works for you and doesn't work for you. These are all, it's like this big learning phase, right? Fire. you living somewhere, you get a job or something, it's like you don't like your job, you just like don't even show up the next day. You just like whatever, just blow it off and get another one. And somebody says, hey, I got an extra room, you can move in. You're like, okay, whatever. So it's like you sort of just do what you want in a sense, depending on your type and depending on your constitution and all these nice things. But this is sort of fire, right? But at some point, some transition begins to occur where you start to kind of gain a certain kind of consistency in your life. You sort of gain, in the sense that you might work the same job for a while. Maybe it's something you enjoy or something you're good at or something that you're just sort of doing, without really thinking about it. You start to gather things around you. You start to maybe have a little more money than you used to have, and so you start to buy things that you like. I like this bed. So when I move, I'm gonna keep it and take it with me. And you might buy a car, and you start to maybe gather material possessions. So this kind of consistency, this gathering of material possessions around you, this kind of consistency is really that transition towards a more sort of staid kind of adulthood. Working the same job for a certain period of time with a thought towards the future. Like, if I stay with this, I could do this by this time. Within 10 years, I could be manager or whatever. This is a very earthy thinking. This is not fiery thinking. This is not fiery thinking. Like, to kind of think of the future is just sort of like fire is sort of what's in the moment. But Earth thinks about the future a bit more. If you think about what Earth is in a sense, Earth is about self-sacrifice. Because if you think about how the Earth, like physical Earth under your feet, how it operates, it just gives and gives and gives with abundance. And it never asks you for anything, does it? Like it just produces broccoli and you take it, and it doesn't say anything to you about it, So it doesn't ask for anything. And this is sort of an earthy quality in people who are earthy. They give and give and give of themselves to their own detriment at times, right? They have trouble saying no to people, and then they don't ask for anything in return. It's like, when they're healthy, it just gives them joy to see people happy, to help people, and to nourish people. Very earthy kind of quality. But when Earth is unhealthy, what happens to them? They have trouble saying no, and they could blow out their knee and ruin their day trying to help somebody out, and then the next day they can't say no, right? So, but this is a very earthy quality. This is kind of self-sacrifice quality, and that's sort of what typifies this time of life for people, this kind of adulthood. This goes for 2 cycles, so until 35 for women and 40 for men. This time is a period where you may work a job that, maybe it wasn't your dream to work 9 to 5 in a cubicle, but there you are. Because why? You may be making that sacrifice because you have now responsibilities. You have car payments, maybe a house payment. You may have children, right? Having children isn't about you. It's about them, so there's this sacrifice that occurs, like the corporation, it's like, not excited to work for a corporation. It wasn't my dream to do that, to make money for them. It's not what I intended to do with my life, yet here I am, right? So this earthiness then is this sort of sense of self-sacrifice, and there's a consistency to Earth. They say, like, if you want to hire somebody for your front desk, you hire somebody who's earthy, because they'll be friendly with your patients, they'll be sweet to your patients, they'll be sympathetic to your patients, but they'll also sort of stick to the job. Because Earth people aren't necessarily known for sort of changing their lives, their own lives, in a sense. They just sort of do whatever they're already doing, in some sense. And so that's kind of what typifies this Earth time period of adulthood. You sort of do the same thing and keep plodding ahead, right? Well, but then, like, some kind of transition occurs. And they say this is that you start to think about yourself again. You've been working hard with your head down, nose to the grindstone, and never thinking about yourself in some sense. And then finally, some kind of thing occurs where you say, "Yeah, but what about my dreams? What about the things that I wanted to do?" And then you kind of stand up, and this is sort of when you start having that thought. This is what we call sort of midlife crisis, isn't it? And this is where you're sort of making that transition to metal. Because depending on who you ask, the metal element is about self-reflection. It's about how well you know yourself. Metal people, metal constitution types, they know themselves to a T. There is no confusion there about who they are. They know exactly. Right, so this transition towards kind of midlife crisis, or what we think of from the transition from adulthood to kind of middle age. Right, I mean, kids are getting a little older. You're starting to have a little more free time, and suddenly you can get your head up a little bit, and you start looking around you, and like, what about that stuff? I always wanted to learn how to golf or whatever. I don't know. So this is this transition towards metal, and we say in Chinese medicine, this is 35 and 40. And this is technically where you go over the hill. Women go over the hill at 35, men go over the hill at 40. Interestingly, this is where the spleen energy, the spleen chi begins to decline at this age. So your spleen is at its strongest in a sense until 35 and 40, and then it just begins that slow decline. Right, and we could talk about that, but this is where this starts, right? So this is the beginning of aging in that sense, that decrease in blood production and all that, right? Okay, so then you hit the metal phase. Metal phase goes for 2 cycles, so 49 and 56, and then towards the end of this metal phase, you transition to old age, in that sense, to retirement age, right? So then you hit the water phase, and this is old age. What one of my teachers called the Taoist phase, right? So most of your life is set in the Confucian phase, where you're sort of managing relationships, but the end is where you get to kind of pull back and relax a little bit and wander around putz around the garden a little bit, right? Okay, so this is the basic setup: wood, fire, earth, metal, water. This is your life. Right? So whatever age you're at, wherever you are mentally, you can kind of look at this, And so then there start to be notions about, for example, people who, I bring this one up because I think it's common, which is people who, for example, don't transition out of fire, let's say. So their fire should end around 21 or 24. And this is your self-expression phase. This is your self-discovery phase. Maybe you're a little bit of party phase, depending. This is where you're trying out new things a lot, and you're really in a very kind of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed sort of mode. And I know people in their mid-30s who are still kind of like that. And so actually Chinese medicine does point to this and say if somebody fails to make a transition, then you could in a sense you could frame a treatment around, in this case, sedating fire and supplementing earth to help them make the transition. So you sort of work out concentric circles. So the outer circle, or the inner, whichever you want to think about it, is the first thing you're thinking to do is, I think this person needs to make this transition from fire to earth. So you set up some way to sedate fire, whatever that means to you, and then another point to supplement earth, and then this sets the tone for the treatment. Then you could add some points that are more specific to their constitution. Then you could add some points that are more specific to their presentation, pulse, and symptoms, and then you can really get granular in what specific symptom do they have. My throat hurts, or something, whatever it is. So you can kind of work inward that way. Many acupuncture systems set up treatments like this. So you sort of think in this notion of concentric circles, from the outside to the in, from the greater to the lesser, in the sense of like perspective, right? So okay, fine. But it does beg the question here about sort of like, how many people are entering the Earth phase at 21 and 24? How many people are having children and doing this self-sacrifice? How many women are having babies at 21 and men at 24? I mean, I got a lot of patients who are 35. They're at the end of the Earth phase. They're like technically transitioning to middle age, and they're thinking about having kids. In the United States, it's very common to push that off for a while. And so it becomes a question about, sort of, is everyone entering, middle age at 35 and 40? Is everyone entering the retirement phase at 49? I mean, at this point, 49 is, it's the new 29. I don't know. So this there's something about the numbers here, right? And okay, so people are living longer. That's usually the first argument given for why these numbers would be different. But it's not clear to me that that's what's going on here necessarily. I have a different notion about this, because if everyone was just getting older and that's why these numbers are sort of stretching out, then we would be implying that childhood, instead of 14 years, is lasting for 22 years or something. I don't know what the math would be, but there'll be some implication that the wood phase of life goes on for longer. But my sense of it is that it's sort of the opposite is what's happening. Since I work so much in pediatrics, it's like, we're saying in a traditional Chinese conception, menarche on average was at 14. Women were getting their first periods at 14. And that used to be the case here in the United States. But what do we know is going on in industrialized nations, in modern economies? The average age of menarche is dropping. I mean, I'm seeing it all the time now. 9-year-olds with breast buds, right? Like children, it's a cliche at this point. Children are growing up so fast, right? So it doesn't seem, if you look at it from that perspective, it doesn't appear that children, wood is stretching out that way. It's almost the opposite. And then on the other side of sort of that, I was just giving the example. Fire, how many people do you know who are 30 and still like teaching yoga and going to festivals and partying? I mean, not to, but you know what I mean? It's a lot of fire. And so I actually, my conception of this is actually that my suspicion here is that fire is actually pushing out in both directions. So fire is sort of coming earlier. So children are entering puberty earlier. And I think that this is true in culture. I mean, children are being exposed to so many adult things, through the internet, news and images and movies and very adult emotions and adult, violence and these kinds of things. Things that were typically reserved for at least a high school kid, maybe, Now it's like, young children, relatively young kids are being exposed to a lot. You have only to send your kid to a public school and they come home talking about pretty weird stuff. And maybe I'm just in a bubble over here, but it's true, right? Kids are growing up so fast. So it seems like fire is pushing into wood. It's kind of shortening up that wood phase. But then fire seems to be pushing into earth on the other side. People are, sort of, they're staying independent for longer, right, as adults. They're pushing marriage off. I mean, a typical marriageable age in a pre-modern society, 14 was good to go. If you had your period, you were ready for marriage, right? So, and if you weren't married by your late teens, early 20s in most places, I mean, you were long in the tooth, right? So this has all changed. And my suspicion here, the reason for this, my suspicion is that I think, in a way, America is a very fiery culture. We're hopeless romantics. We're to a fault obsessed with independence. We're obsessed with individuality. I mean, you go to Asia and they look at our culture and they say, "Oh, you guys are very, selfish in a way." That's it's how they conceive of us. And we can be. But on the other hand, we're about, we have this very romantic idea about sort of a manifest destiny that we can evolve, that we are sort of fit for evolution, in a mental, spiritual sense. So, and this all strikes me as very fiery, right? And, think about America as a culture or as a country. It's like we went from, as a country, in a sense, we went from, being a fairly small backwater colonial colony, basically, to the dominant world power in a very short order. In the way that fire grows, it tends to explode. You ever set a Christmas tree on fire? Fire just kind of explodes out of nowhere. But then fire is somewhat ephemeral, and we've had a good run at it, but it's all the talk is about, China's been talking about America as a failing nation for a long time. I mean, I've been going to China now for, off and on for 15, 20 years now. And I remember 20 years ago being there and having them refer to my country as a failing state, so to speak. And now you're really seeing it. It's all is America's economy and blah 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 blah. And this notion that America may be sort of shifting its global dominance, and then politics being what they are, and certain political parties trying to reassert this kind of dominance and blah 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 blah. Right? Okay, so this notion then of fire. So if you think about, well, what culture in that sense did America come out of? Well, it kind of comes out of Europe, really. It's the European colonialists move into America and sort of take over. But this is exactly how the European powers operated. They literally were sending out wooden boats, like little roots, into all the places they could get to, putting down roots, taking all the resources, like a root would do, and then on top of that, telling everyone that they're useless and trying to tell them how to think. This all strikes me as very Woody behavior. Nobody but me knows anything. I'm right about everything, and everyone should think like me, and the world would be a cool place. This strikes me as so Woody, right? So my sense of this is that Europe was sort of that Woody culture, sending out their little wooden boats, and telling everyone what to do. Then that locus of power shifts to America, fire. Well, then it's funny because you talk to political commentators and economic commentators and stuff, it would appear that, it appears that we're not going to go down without a fight, but to some degree, there's this notion that the locus of power in the world is shifting. And where is it shifting to? Well, most people would probably say China. Most people would say probably Asia in general. You look at India, you look at these countries, huge, massive. So, and what do the Chinese call themselves? The middle people. They are very earthy in that sense. You go to China and hang out there, and they say, "Oh, we Chinese people are very earth constitution. You Europeans and Americans are very wood constitution. We are very earth constitution." They are earth people, in that sense. They say they are. They call themselves that, right? So, is the locus of power should go kind of wood, fire to earth? So, and China has a long history of empire building and consistency around this. And it's a culture of self-sacrifice, isn't it? Right. So these are the kinds of thought processes that occur to me in this context. So America being a very fiery sort of culture, then think about it. Think about this. What's our export? Our export is ideas. It's invisible. You can't hold an idea. We export light. Like movies and music, and we export culture. What was the old line? What was that guy's name? Paul Mooney said, "The black man in America is the most copied man on the planet." This is an idea. This is a mood. This is a feeling. This is not something tangible. This all strikes me as very fiery. modern culture, you know, sort of modern industrialization, post-industrial cultures. I mean, this is all very fiery stuff. You know, it's Amazon. I want it now. I want things faster. Everything's moving faster and faster and faster. This all strikes me as very, very fiery. And I think this fiery notion of evolution and growth, and it strikes me as very American, and it has infected the whole world, for better or for worse. So this notion of America, we export ideas, we export light, you know, digits, this kind of thing, you know, movies and music and ideas. So this all strikes me as very fiery. So I think that fire is sort of the dominant factor, and it's pushing our lives to look like that more. We are reflecting this increase in fire. So we're pushing into wood, into childhood, forcing children to grow up fast, and we're holding on to this independence and this sort of adolescence, pseudo-adolescence, this, you know, something like that, into later years, for what that's worth. Okay? All right. I think that's all I have to say about that. As usual, guys, reach out to me. I've had a few of you reach out to me, say hi. I'm always around, and cool. All right. Take it easy. Yeah.